Philip. He's going to talk about the OSHchip, which is a, well, let's see, one product, two views, talking about not only how you can use it for prototyping, stuff like that, but also how you can use it for chip design. And I'm sure Philip will talk about his experience doing as much. So please welcome him forward.
Good evening, folks. Can people at the back hear me? Yep, wonderful. So I'm Philip Freidin. I'm the designer of OSHchip, and I would like to present this with as little salesy stuff as possible. But if it gets too salesy, just shout out and I'll tone it down a bit. This is a project I've been working on for just on 15 months now, and it's just recently started to sell. So what OSHchip is a processor board with an ARM Cortex M0 processor, 32-bit processor, made by Nordic Semiconductor. That's that little bit there. And one of the most interesting things about this processor chip is it has a built-in Bluetooth low-energy radio. And so the biggest component, actually the biggest component is the connector. The second biggest component is the antenna. And then because it's, my concept was make it as much like an integrated circuit as possible, it's actually packaged like a 16-pin chip. And that's actually a better picture of it. You can see some very IC-like pins. In fact, of the whole project, the pins were the hardest part. It turns out the pins are not a commodity product you can go out and buy. It took me probably a total of 3 months of work to get to the pins that I ended up with. Right? There were several prototypes that didn't look as nice, and some very frustrating negotiations with the companies that make pins for a business that involved NREs of $25,000 and minimum order quantities of 750,000 pins. Right? So much as I would like to say that I predicted that I would have volumes that would be able to use that many pins, I'm somewhat more realistic, and so did I just screw up this? I thought I had this on full.
You just flipped out of it.
How did I do that? I pushed the wrong button, didn't I? Oop, back again. All right, I'll. Okay. So, in terms of performance, this is probably, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 times the performance of any of the Arduino type products. So it's a nice step up from that. Its primary goal in terms of packaging was that this would plug into these wireless prototype boards that all the hobbyists use. So the target market is hobbyists, right? So there was no expectation that this would be something that I would be mass producing, although it looks like that may change. If you look at all the other processor boards out there, they're all bigger than this, which means that when you try to put them on these types of boards, they cover up most of the holes where you would normally want to be plugging the wires in. So this fits right in the middle row, doesn't cover anything up, and that's probably enough to say about that. Let's see, what else? I don't know, what's my next picture? Oh, so there is a connector on top, and the connector is used for programming. So as expected for a 16-pin chip, everybody knows that that pin there is the power pin, right, on 16. That one over there is, that one. That there's ground, and you're left with 14 I/O pins. Now, if you look at pretty much anybody else's processor boards, right, whether it's Arduinos or other stuff, you'll usually see this pin map that says you've got serial port on these pins, I2C on others. And if you look at the full list of peripherals in a chip, right, if you counted up all the pins they need, the boards typically don't have enough pins. And so different functions share pins. So you can have 3 serial ports but no I2C, or those types of trade-offs, just because of the way they're connected to the pins. One of the great features of the processor I've chosen is it has a full crossbar between all the peripherals and all the pins. So you can have, this has too many peripherals, right, for the available pins, even if it wasn't restricted to the 14 that I cut it down to, right? Normally it has about 31 I/O pins, right? I've knocked that down to 14 because of my packaging, but you can still use any combination of peripherals up to 14 pins worth of I/O. Okay, so that's a really neat feature of this chip. Another great feature of Nordic's chip is it has this, what they call task and event system, where peripheral functions can be triggered to do whatever their general function is by generating or sending to it a task signal. And peripheral functions, when they finish what they do, tend to generate event signals. So there's another full crossbar in this chip that connects all the task signals to all the event signals, and you can basically tell something like a counter timer, when it times out it generates an event, and that gets routed to the A to D converter, which then starts to do an A to D conversion, and when that ends it generates an event that goes to a DMA controller that then does a transfer, and when that's done it generates an event that goes back to the counter timer to tell it to start up again, right? All of that can run with the processor turned off. So you can run with the processor not doing anything at all, shut down, 0 milliamps, and the system, if you've got an environment where this task event system works for you, right, it'll all run autonomously. So these chips are designed primarily for the health and fitness market, but they're just a great general purpose processor, even if you never turn the radio on, right? But hey, by the way, there's a Bluetooth radio. So I do actually have a pair of units with me today, and so I've stuck them on a board, and I have a dummy little program running on it. So you can just pass this around. It does need to come back to me, and I have 2 of them here. So I'll pass the other one. I think, where does that go? I think that goes. Okay, yeah. So just careful with the battery pack. Okay, so that just lets you see it's kind of really tiny, so if you look at it there, it's kind of hard to see the details, which is why I have some nice big pictures. Another characteristic of this that really separates it from all your general processor boards that hobbyists tend to use is that for all of those hobbyist processor boards, you don't have any decent debug capability, right? You've got printf and flasher LED. And if you stick that printf at the wrong place, then it means go move the printf, change what it's printing, and then recompile and have another go at playing, find the bug. So OSHchip makes deliberate use of the facilities that Nordic built in, which is a full debug engine inside this processor, and you communicate to it through that 4-pin header. So it's used both for programming and full debug. And by that I mean you'd link into the Kyle compiler and debug environment, which gives you breakpoints, looking at variables while when you've halted the processor, changing variables, examining memory, watching variables while the processor is running at full speed, right? Because it has comparators that you can set to watch specific memory locations. So you can basically do non-invasive catching of writes, reads, and various other things. So all of that goes through that top connector, which of course once you've finished debugging, you disconnect and you just have that plugged on your board. So the standard debug cable that ARM recommends is this 10-pin cable with a 50 mil pitch. So that's standard. It's called a Cortex M0 debug cable. But it has 10 pins. I only need 4, so I have a little transition board that converts the 10 signals down to the 4 that I need. And of course, there has to be something at the other end of the cable, and that's the OSHchip programmer and debugger. So typically, you buy one of these and a large number of OSHchips. As many as you want. They're like chips. One is never enough. So you have a 10-pin signals coming out of here. The other end goes off to USB.
I know you said this isn't a sales pitch, but how
Sorry.
much are the OSHchips?
Oh, so OSHchips are $25 and the programmer is $35. And that's the last time I want to talk about money. Unless you want to throw some at me. So this here is actually pretty damn cool. So this does the debug interface, which is something called CMSIS-DAP, which means something to someone at ARM back in the UK. I can't even remember. DAP stands for Debug Access Port, and CMSIS means CMSIS. Anyway, that's one of 3 things this does. A second thing it does is embed drag and drop programming. So embed drag and drop programming means that when you plug this in, it shows up on your Linux system, on your Mac system, or on your Windows system as a USB memory stick with a file system. And all you have to do is drag your hex file and drop it onto that drive, and it won't show up in the directory. It never actually has any persistence there. It actually, it actually goes through here, through another Cortex M0 processor, which reads hex and writes programming code, right, the programming protocol that the OSHchip expects. Okay? And last but not least, those 2 pins are serial I/O. So it gives you a 9600 to 115K UART thing. So this actually shows up in your device manager as actually 3 devices, as the SimSys-DAP programmer, as the drag and drop disk drive, and as a virtual COM port. And typically you either stick a jumper over this if you're just doing loopback to make sure you've got your serial program running correctly. Right? How many times have you been debugging wires when you haven't got your comms program set up right? So just stick a jumper here and you've got loopback. Otherwise, you run 2 wires from here down into your target system to the UART, which is on which pin? Any 2 that you like except power and ground. Okay? All right. So let me take a 3-minute break from shouting and ask, are there any questions about this before I go on to not this? Sure.
So I really want to buy all this stuff, but do you sell the pins also?
So amazingly enough, you are the nth person to like my pin design. Thank you. So not yet, but definitely eventually.
Excellent.
And where eventually is later this year, but I can't tell you when because I need all the pins I have to build the next batch of these things. And tragically, they aren't going to be cheap. It's going to run probably around 20 cents a pin.
Okay.
Right? But it's amazing and a little bit tragic how much interest has been expressed in the pins.
I tried to do the same thing before. It's really hard.
Yeah, like I said, it took me 3 months to get to these. Okay, you had a question?
FCC certified?
No, it isn't. This is a component. This is not a. This is absolutely not a system. This is a component, and so just as you don't get FCC when you buy the chip that Nordic ships, you don't get an FCC for this either. If you're a hobbyist and you're building 1 or 2, just don't annoy your neighbors, right? If you want to go into production, my product is not the right thing to use. You use my product to speed up your prototyping because you don't have to spin a board to get started, right? But there are lots of companies that make modules with FCC, go buy one of their modules. Okay, any others? Oh, okay, follow up?
Part two. So bootloader, can I send code over Bluetooth to it?
Oh, yeah. So both Nordic and Nordic through the Embed Environment have firmware update over the air. So it does exist. I've never used it, right? But it's something that is already being used by other people with exactly the same processor I am. Okay, and there's a guy just behind you.
What kind of antenna is this?
So the antenna is right there, and these are intended to be on a PC board with a little bit more clearance around them, but I had a problem that I'm constrained to a 350 mil package. So I will tell you that the radio range is not as great as it could be. It's about 10 to 20 feet, depending on what you're connecting, on what else you've got around it. But primarily, I've architected this as a prototyping thing. So if you really care about range, then you have to use something else. Okay? Yep.
How much control do you have over the profiles and the BLE characteristics?
You have complete control over it. You can create your own, right? Or, I mean, Nordic has, done all of the standard set of profiles are already supported. I guess I should also point out the radio does, as well as Bluetooth Low Energy, it does 3 other protocols which are basically they're unique to Nordic. Something called Gazelle, which I've used a lot. Another one called Shock Burst, which Logitech and Microsoft use for all their keyboards and mice. And then there's Ant, which is also used in the health and fitness market. So this will do all of those. I need to move on because someone's going to tell me how much time I have left. Anyone?
Oh, maybe.
I'm next. You have as much time as you want. This is fascinating.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so you tell me when I'm done.
You have till 8.
What time?
You've got half an hour.
I got half an hour? Cool, let me keep going. Yeah, give me a 5-minute warning when I should really wrap it up. Okay, so all of what I've told you is what I would call the traditional way people buy processor boards, right? You have some project in mind, you're going to build one or more of them. You hopefully want an environment that is conducive to doing prototyping and experimentation. I've at least removed one PC board out of that process, right, if you're looking for building something small. In fact, just as there have been people expressing interest in the pins, I've also had people interested in my board without the pins, because that then is the smallest processor board you could buy. And if you wanted to make like your own smartwatch, right, this thing without pins is well within the bounding box that would be a smartphone, sorry, a smartwatch, right? So, but all of this is general purpose processor, right? And what I want to talk to you about today is none of that. I want to talk to you about the reason it's called OSHchip. So first of all, I've said enough times it's open source hardware, okay? That's why it's OSH at the beginning, but it's also chip at the end. And if you want to find all the schematics in PDFs, all the design files in Altium, all the Gerbers already built for you so that you can build them yourself and put me out of business, it's all on GitHub, and the account is OSHchip. You won't find the pins there. Okay. So now I'd like to talk about a totally different view for OSHchip. Oh, by the way, that's how it all connects together, right? Okay. So I spent a significant portion of my career being involved in chip design. And one of the most wonderful experiences for me, and certainly the one that convinced me that my move from Australia to the US was the right move, is the feeling I get when I've designed a chip and I see it being used by someone else in their project. Right? It's probably equivalent to giving birth. What would I know? So what I wanted to do with OSHchip was create a platform for any hobbyist to become a chip designer, all right? And by that I mean create something that is packaged like a chip, documented like a chip, picked and chosen among other products, just like you would pick and choose other chips, and used just like a chip. So, what am I talking about? It turns out this is not a new idea. It's been around at least 35 years, because that's when I first saw it. There are companies that sell products that appear in integrated circuit catalogs with data sheets that say they do some interesting function. And if you took the lid off that package, what you would find inside is a general purpose processor, maybe even a standard product from that company that has been pre-programmed with firmware to do that special function. In terms of products like that I see today, the Cypress Semiconductor USB to serial chips. Hidden underneath that label, it's an 8051 microprocessor with, I believe, flash memory that gets pre-programmed. And they can do multiple different products by loading different firmware. So what I want to present to you is the idea of OSHchip as a platform for end users, hobbyists, to create chips. And so I'm going to walk you through my long-term vision, right? So all of this is in process with no idea of when I'll have enough of it ready, but this is the path I'm on, right? The first part was get the platform built, debugged, and ready to use. So I've done the first half, and I will hopefully get some sales of people who just want to use OSHchips as what I call view 1. Let me walk you through view 2. So view 2 is you're sitting there having a few beers, probably at a Hackaday meeting, and you come up with an idea for a chip. Now, there are going to be constraints imposed on you by the available technology, right? So if you want to build an 8-bit shift register that runs at 100 megahertz, then this is not the platform for you, right? Unfortunately, you're going to have to go off and design full custom silicon. But if you can come up with a product which can be implemented as a mixture of firmware running on a 32-bit processor with a quarter of a megabyte. That's a huge amount for a micro. A quarter of a megabyte of flash memory, 32K of on-chip RAM, a Bluetooth radio, a Gazelle radio, counters, timers, A to D converters, PWM, AES encryption, right? There's a shopping list that Nordic's already put on the chip. I didn't even have to do it. If you can come up with an idea for a chip that sits within that bounding box of those resources, then you can start heading through this flowchart. So you come up with an idea. Let's see, I'm going to just out of nowhere come up with an idea. Oh, every single hobbyist at some point has to interface a 2-line by 16 character LCD to their project. And every hobbyist at some point has to read that insane data sheet with the startup sequence that does not work, ever. Right? No one has ever implemented that and had it work first time. Never. So, rather than hobbyists keep doing that, what if we created a chip that on one side talked to a 2-line by 16 character LCD in the 4-bit interface mode, right? I assume most of you know what I'm talking about. Hands up, yes. Good enough. Yeah, right. Everybody has had to do it, right? So the 4-line interface plus you need read strobe, write strobe, chip enable, and command/data, right? So you've got 4 control lines, 4 data lines. I've got 14, so I've blown 8. I think I've got a few left over. So let's see, how would I want to talk to this new chip? How about I2C, SPI. How about serial data at 9600 baud? And by the way, I'd like this to be able to take some extra control characters, which makes it automatically scroll or blink or switch between 5 different pages of text, right? I've got 32K of RAM on here. I've got to figure out what to do with that, right? So here's my chip idea, right? An LCD controller, right? Do it once, and then from then on, just keep using that chip. Okay, so go off and discuss your chip idea with your friends, right? Here's your market research, right? Bounce, ooh, there's an arrowhead missing here, right? Bounce back and forward until you agree on the pinout, the functionality, etc. When it's all good, you stop looping and you go do the design, right? Small matter of programming. And debug. Oh, good, there's good debug capability for this. Better than any chip that I've ever worked on, right? Right? This gives you a microscope into the middle of it. Then, once you've done your design and you've debugged it, as a professional chip designer now, you have some responsibilities. One is you need to submit it into some vetting process. We'll talk more about that. You're going to need to create a data sheet, some application examples, block diagram or two, and if you're a good boy or girl, you should write a few tests to prove that it works, although you might hide those and say they're part of the application stuff. So what could I do to help this process? Right here, my website, eventually, will have the datasheet creation section. And so you'll go in there as part of you'll upload your C code, you upload the compiled hex, and then it'll take you over to the datasheet section, and it will fill in all the datasheet that it can. It'll fill in all the electrical parameters, because I already know what those are, right? It knows at least some of the pinout, right? It knows where power and ground are. It can ask you for the rest of them. So it will basically automate the process of creating the pinout diagram. The electrical specs will already be in there. It'll walk you through the bullet list that has to be on the front page. It'll ask you for a paragraph or two of description, and it will require you to upload some text and images, etc. Right? So it'll walk you through all the bits of documentation, and it's up to you to do a reasonable job of it. At some point, the whole lot, you push the submit button and say, I've finished uploading my design, and it now comes to here, the review section. This is where the website's benevolent dictator will now review the design. Initially, there'll only be one benevolent dictator, right? Because initially there won't be a lot of designs. But as the community grows, I hope, there will be, just as you, in a forum area, you have additional, what do you call them? Moderators. We'll have additional reviewers. The reviewer's job is to look at the code and check that it's been reasonably commented, right? Check that it can be recompiled and generates an identical hex file. Has a look at how the data sheet's been filled in, etc. And the reviewer, because that reviewer really cares about this community, will work with the original designer to improve the data sheet until it meets his exacting standards. At which point, it stops being reviewed and it becomes approved, right? You get approved. And when that happens, 3 exciting things take place. Your design, Mr. Hobbyist Chip Designer, you now have something that is unique in the world. You will be assigned a unique part number for your project. 74, because it has to be 74. RF, because that just makes sense. BLE, well, if you've used the BLE radio, it'll be in there. If you used Gazelle, it'll be GAZ. If it's enhanced shock burst, it'll be ESB, and a number. So we'll assign basically a unique part number to your design. and it will go to a different part of the website, no longer sitting in the submit queue. It will now be part of the catalog. And the catalog will have the datasheet, the C code, and the hex file for anybody to download. And so over time, in my best dream, over time, that catalog will grow with more and more hobbyist designed open source chips, all using OSHchip as the platform. For an end user, another hobbyist, you just buy a blank OSHchip and download the design. Now you might say $25 for an LCD controller is kind of outrageous, but the good news is we're hobbyists and we are prototyping stuff, and when we're done, we're going to pull it apart and build something different. OSHchip gets to be reused. Put a new catalog design in it, right? Every time you start a new project, take your old OSHchips, reprogram them with things from the catalog or with things of your own. Last but not least, hardly least, is associated with the name of the person who submitted the project. They get a reputation point in the reputation system as a chip designer. And so every time they upload a design and it gets through the approval process, they get a reputation point as a chip designer. At some point, somebody downloads their design. The designer gets a reputation point every time someone downloads their design. At some point, somebody takes the design they downloaded and creates a derivative and uploads it as a derivative design. That new designer gets a reputation point after they've run the gauntlet, but the original designer gets a reputation point for creating a design that was a good enough documentation and design that someone was able to create a derivative. What if you're not into chip design so much, but you really like the community in the forums, and so you spend a lot of time on the forums answering questions? So if you're on the forum and you answer someone's question and the answer gets upvoted and ticked as an accepted answer to a question, think the Stack Exchange type websites, then you get a reputation point, not as a chip designer, you get a reputation point as an applications engineer, because that's what you just did, right? It's the role of an apps engineer. Elsewhere in our virtual chip company, elsewhere we have people who can dream up a chip, but they don't really have the skills to do it, but they do have good writing skills and drawing skills, or maybe they collaborate with someone else on a project, right? And so they actually enter the process here, and they write the data sheet for the chip they want, right? And when they've done that, then that goes into the queue of project ideas waiting for volunteers to take them and run with them. We have a name for that. It's our strategic marketing team, right? The people who dream up what the next product should be. So give them a reputation point. In fact, I'll give reputation points away for pretty much anything because they don't cost me anything, right? So the person who starts by writing a data sheet, they get a reputation point as a marketing person within the OSHchip community. Man, I've got to somehow give those reputation points value. I got it. There'll be a store where not only do I sell OSHchips and programmers, but t-shirts and mugs. I'll get Chris Gamble to help me on that because he's really good on t-shirts and mugs. So we'll have t-shirts and mugs that say, I'm an OSHchip chip designer, or I'm an OSHchip applications engineer. And you will not be able to buy those unless you have the reputation points to say that you've put in the work. That is the end of what I wanted to tell you about. Thank you. Can I open it up to questions again? Thank you. Yes?
So what are you doing on the SDK side? Because the Nordic provided soft device SDK is pretty rough.
Okay. Okay, so that's an excellent question. So I actually have 3 or 4 different paths that I'm running down concurrently. So first of all, the Nordic SDK actually, I believe, is excellent. Compared to other companies' radio libraries, the Nordic one is pretty good and is fairly well documented. So, and in fact, there's nothing you can do with the Nordic chip without using their libraries, to be honest. So it's the Nordic libraries and the Kyle compiler if you want to, if you want to do, take advantage of the debug capabilities, and in particular, if you don't need the radio, right? But also if you do want to use the radio. In that environment with the Nordic compiler, there is a constraint of not more than 32K of user code. I've been using Nordic chips, this one in particular, for almost 3 years now. I've yet to break 32K. So my experience is you can write quite significant applications within that compiler limitation. The second environment is the Embed environment. And I'm currently in discussions with Embed, and this will eventually have Embed enabled written on it. I'm not quite sure where I'll write it, but somewhere, maybe along here, it'll say Embed enabled. But basically that is their online browser-based compiler, which happens to have a nice abstraction layer on top of the Nordic stuff, which hides almost all of the stuff, except when you get into the Bluetooth area where you really can't avoid it. So that gives you the ability of writing programs as there's no memory size limit and no operating system, right? You can, any computer that runs a browser can run Embed. Third is GCC. And my current plan for GCC is that unfortunately getting GCC up and running for some people is easy. For other people, it's a little bit too much. So my plan is basically build an Ubuntu VM that runs inside VirtualBox and basically build and debug a GCC plus Nordic compile and build environment and ship that VM as a complete unit with here's the script you run, and basically it won't matter what you're running. If you can run VirtualBox, then you'll get this pre-built and debugged compile environment.
Thank you.
Okay.
Will you support debugging or GDB through GCC?
So I haven't gone down that path, but all the hooks are there. So I should make it clear, I am looking for people who would like to contribute to this project. So if any of this inspires you and you have special skills that might help me move my project along, I would be delighted to talk to you. So if you have experience, so for instance, there's actually 2 tools to sort of work with that help that process. One is something called Pi OCD, which talks to OSHchip. I've already tested that. And then there's something called OpenOCD, which is the layer that sits between basically the chip and the GDB debugger, right? So there are other people already using OpenOCD with the Nordic chip doing debug.
So that's implicit J-Link?
You don't need J-Link. You can do it with you can do it with that, right? So OpenOCD understands Simsys DAP. Okay. Any other questions?
If you change in your block diagram to that submit button, if you change that word to print, would it be a chip printer?
Very close. Certainly enough to make Chris happy. Okay. What happened to my boards?
They're back here.
Good. Thank you. Scavenge for the chips. Okay. So I hope that wasn't too salesy, and thank you very much for letting me tell you my dreams.